In May 1941, the German Kriegsmarine launched Operation Rheinübung, Rhine Exercise, an ambitious sortie designed to disrupt Allied convoy routes in the Atlantic Ocean. The operation centered on deploying Germany's newest and most formidable capital ship, the battleship Bismarck, alongside the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, to attack the vital supply lines connecting North America with Great Britain. At a time when Britain stood virtually alone against Nazi Germany, these convoys represented the nation's lifeline, carrying essential food, raw materials, and military equipment necessary for continued resistance. The Bismarck represented the pinnacle of German naval engineering and power projection. Commissioned in August 1940, the vessel displaced approximately 50,300 tons at full load and measured 251 meters in length. Armed with 8 38-centimeter, 15-inch guns arranged in 4 twin turrets, 12 15-centimeter guns, and extensive anti-aircraft armament, the battleship embodied the traditional naval doctrine of gun-based surface combat. Her armor belt measured up to 320 millimeters thick in critical areas, designed to withstand direct hits from enemy capital ships. The ship could achieve speeds exceeding 30 knots, providing both offensive striking power and the ability to disengage from unfavorable encounters. 1.2 The destruction of HMS Hood, an initial success. On May 24, 1941, in the Denmark Strait between Greenland and Iceland, Bismarck encountered a British interception force consisting of the battlecruiser HMS Hood and the newly commissioned battleship HMS Prince of Wales. What followed became one of the most shocking naval engagements of the war. At approximately 5:52 hours, at a range of roughly 13 miles, both forces opened fire. Within minutes, the battle reached its catastrophic conclusion. The 8th shell of the 5th salvo from Bismarck struck the anti-aircraft magazine of Hood, causing an explosion that irreparably damaged the vessel. The massive detonation broke the battlecruiser's back, and within 3 minutes, HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy and symbol of British naval supremacy between the wars, sank beneath the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. Of her crew of 1,418 men, only 3 survived. Admiral Lancelot Holland perished with his ship. The loss sent shockwaves through the Royal Navy and the British government. The engagement continued as Bismarck and Prinz Eugen turned their guns on HMS Prince of Wales. Within moments, the bridge of Prince of Wales was destroyed, and the ship sustained significant damage. The British battleship, still working through mechanical issues with civilian contractors aboard, was forced to disengage. However, Prince of Wales had scored several hits on Bismarck, with one shell rupturing fuel tanks in the German ship's bow, contaminating fuel supplies, and causing a steady leak that left the telltale oil slick on the ocean surface. 1.3 Churchill's imperative: sink the Bismarck. The destruction of HMS Hood created an immediate crisis for the British Admiralty. Winston Churchill, understanding both the practical military threat and the profound psychological impact of allowing such a victory to go unpunished, issued his famous order to the Royal Navy: sink the Bismarck. The directive was unambiguous. Every available warship was to be directed toward hunting down and destroying the German battleship. Admiral Gunther Lütjens, commanding the German force from Bismarck, recognized that damage to his ship's fuel system had compromised the mission. Rather than continue the raiding operation against convoys, he made the tactical decision to separate from Prinz Eugen and head for the port of Brest in German-occupied France, where repairs could be effected. If Bismarck could reach the relative safety of Brest, she would come under the protective umbrella of Luftwaffe air cover and could potentially sortie again once repaired, remaining a persistent threat to Allied shipping. 2. The hunt, aerial reconnaissance, and naval pursuit. 2.1 Loss and rediscovery of contact. On May 25, 1941, The pursuing British forces lost contact with Bismarck. For approximately 31 hours, the German battleship's position remained unknown to the Royal Navy. The British forces initially searched to the northeast, assuming Bismarck would attempt to return to Norway. However, Admiral Lutyens had directed the ship on a southeasterly course toward France. The break in contact might have allowed Bismarck to escape entirely, but Admiral Lutyens made a critical error. Apparently unaware that British forces had temporarily lost his position, he broke radio silence to send an extended coded message to Germany. British intelligence intercepted this transmission, and though they could not immediately decode its full content, the transmission allowed them to obtain a bearing on Bismarck's position. This intelligence narrowed the search area considerably. 2.2 The critical Catalina sighting. At approximately 10:30 hours on May 26, 1941, a consolidated PBY Catalina flying boat of RAF Coastal Command, operating at extreme range, spotted Bismarck through a break in the cloud cover. The aircraft was piloted by British flying officer Dennis Briggs and co-piloted by U.S. Navy observer Ensign Leonard B. Smith. Smith was at the controls when he observed the distinctive wake and oil slick of the German battleship and immediately reported the position to the Admiralty. This sighting represented a decisive intelligence breakthrough. Bismarck's position was now known with precision, approximately 690 nautical miles from Brest. The battleship was less than 24 hours from reaching the protective range of German land-based aircraft operating from French airfields. The pursuing British battleships HMS King George V and HMS Rodney, though powerful, could not close the distance in time unless Bismarck could be significantly slowed or stopped. 2.3 Force H, Britain's last hope. The responsibility for stopping Bismarck fell to Force H, the Royal Navy's Gibraltar-based squadron commanded by Vice Admiral James Somerville. Force H consisted of the battlecruiser HMS Renown, the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal, the light cruiser HMS Sheffield, and escorting destroyers. Critically, Ark Royal carried squadrons of Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers, obsolescent biplanes that represented Britain's only means of potentially crippling Bismarck before she reached safety. The strategic calculation was straightforward but daunting. Unless torpedo-carrying aircraft could damage Bismarck sufficiently to slow her down or impair her maneuverability, the German battleship would reach Brest, the hunt would fail, and Churchill's imperative would go unfulfilled. The weight of this responsibility fell upon the aircrew of Ark Royal's torpedo squadrons. 3. The Fairey Swordfish, an obsolescent weapon system. 3.1 Design and technical specifications. The Fairey Swordfish biplane torpedo bomber, affectionately nicknamed Stringbag by its crews, represented 1930s naval aviation technology pressed into service during a war that had rapidly advanced beyond its original design parameters. Manufactured at Fairey's factory in Hayes, West London, the first production aircraft was completed in early 1936 and entered service with the Fleet Air Arm in July 1936. The aircraft specifications reflected its interwar origins. Constructed with a metal frame covered in fabric, the Swordfish featured a biplane configuration with two wings connected by struts and wire bracing. Powered by a single Bristol Pegasus radial engine producing 690 horsepower, the aircraft achieved a maximum speed of approximately 138 miles per hour in level flight, speeds that would have been considered adequate in the mid-1930s but were dangerously slow by 1941 standards. The Swordfish carried a crew of 3, a pilot, an observer who handled navigation and served as bombardier, and a telegraphist airgunner, TAG, who operated a defensive .303 caliber Vickers machine gun and managed radio communications. The cockpits were open to the elements, offering no protection from wind, cold, or precipitation. In the North Atlantic in May, with temperatures near freezing and fierce winds, these conditions tested human endurance to its limits. As a torpedo bomber, the Swordfish could carry a single 18-inch, 45-centimeter torpedo weighing approximately 1,610 pounds, 730 kilograms, or alternatively could be armed with bombs, depth charges, or mines depending on the mission requirements. The standard torpedo attack profile required the aircraft to approach at very low altitude, typically 20 to 50 feet above the water surface, reduce speed to approximately 90 miles per hour, and release the torpedo at a distance of 500 to 1,000 yards from the target to allow the weapon to stabilize in the water and begin to run. 3.2 Apparent obsolescence and hidden advantages. By 1941, the Swordfish appeared hopelessly outclassed by contemporary military aircraft. Modern single-engine fighters could achieve speeds 2 to 3 times greater. The fabric-covered biplane seemed a relic from an earlier era of aviation. Yet this apparent obsolescence concealed certain tactical advantages in specific circumstances. The aircraft's slow speed, while generally disadvantageous, created difficulties for enemy range-finding and fire control systems. German rangefinders were calibrated for enemy aircraft approach speeds below 100 knots, and the Swordfish's even slower speeds created aiming challenges. Additionally, when attacking at extremely low altitudes, the Swordfish could fly below the depression limits of many anti-aircraft weapons designed primarily for higher altitude threats. The aircraft's robust construction and simple systems provided reliability under harsh conditions. The fabric covering could be punctured by shell fragments without catastrophically compromising the airframe's structural integrity, whereas modern metal-skinned aircraft might suffer more extensive damage from the same hits. The biplane's low stall speed and benign handling characteristics made it more forgiving during night operations and in poor weather conditions, circumstances that would ground more advanced aircraft. 3.3 Provence combat record. Despite its antiquated appearance, the Swordfish had already proven itself in combat operations. On November 11th, 1940, Swordfish from HMS Illustrious conducted the famous attack on the Italian naval base at Taranto. The 6 torpedo-armed Swordfish inflicted serious damage on 3 battleships, with 2 cruisers, 2 destroyers, and other vessels damaged or sunk. This attack demonstrated that naval aircraft were independently capable of immobilizing an entire fleet and fundamentally altered strategic thinking about naval power projection. The success at Taranto had been studied carefully by other naval powers. The Japanese assistant naval attaché to Berlin, Takeshi Nato, visited Taranto to view the consequences of the attack and later briefed the staff who planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. Thus, the Swordfish had already influenced the course of naval warfare in ways that would become evident 7 months after the Bismarck engagement. 4. The First Strike, HMS Victorious attack of May 24, 1941. 4.1 Operational conditions and launch. Before Ark Royal's involvement, the first aerial torpedo attack against Bismarck came from HMS Victorious, a newer fleet carrier that happened to be in position for a hasty strike. On the evening of May 24, 1941, as darkness approached and weather conditions deteriorated, Victorious launched 9 Swordfish of 825 Naval Air Squadron under the command of Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond. The operational conditions were extremely challenging. Darkness was already settling as Esmond led the formation of Swordfish biplanes toward the unsuspecting Bismarck 120 miles away. The aircrew faced the prospect of a long overwater flight in deteriorating weather, a coordinated attack against a heavily armed target, and a night landing back on the carrier deck, an operation requiring considerable skill even under ideal conditions. 4.2 Coordinated night attack. The attacking force divided into 3 flights to approach Bismarck from multiple directions, complicating the ship's defensive response and increasing the probability of successful torpedo launches. The aircraft reached Bismarck just before midnight and delivered a courageous attack amid a hail of anti-aircraft fire. Lieutenant Percy Jick, flying the second wave, demonstrated exemplary airmanship and determination. Jick was not satisfied with his initial run-in position, turned, and came in again against an inferno of fire, this time scoring a torpedo hit amidships. Petty Officer Les Sayre, serving as Jick's telegraphist air gunner, later provided a vivid description of the attack approach. "We dropped our fish from 500 yards and at a height of 20 feet. We turned away, and by the time the gun crews had woken up, we were 20 miles away. They then opened up with their 15-inch main armament. The violence of Bismarck's defensive fire was extraordinary. Even though the Swordfish escaped being shot down, the near misses from the battleship's heavy guns created immense waterspouts. When Sayre's aircraft hit one of these shell splashes, all the fabric at the bottom of the aircraft was torn away, leaving him suspended above the sea for the return flight, which he characteristically described as merely a bit drafty in the back. 4.3 limited damage and consequences. The torpedo hit scored by Lieutenant Jick struck Bismarck amidships against her heavily armored belt. While the explosion did not penetrate the ship's armor, it had significant indirect effects. The evasive action Bismarck took in response to the attack ripped apart temporary repairs that had been made to oil tanks damaged earlier by Prince of Wales, crucially slowing the ship and leaving a more pronounced oil trail. Miraculously, all 9 Swordfish returned safely to Victorious. 3 of the pilots had never previously carried out a deck landing at night, yet all successfully recovered aboard the carrier despite equipment failures and battle damage. This first strike demonstrated both the courage of the Fleet Air Arm aircrew and the remarkable difficulty of sinking a modern, heavily armored battleship with aerial torpedoes. The attack from Victorious had achieved only limited success. Bismarck remained capable of high speed and was still heading toward France. The primary effect was the further degradation of her fuel situation and the maintenance of contact with pursuing forces. The decisive blow would have to come from elsewhere. The decisive attack, May 26, 1941. 5.1 The mistaken attack on HMS Sheffield. On the afternoon of May 26th, with time running out before Bismarck could reach French waters, Ark Royal prepared to launch a full strike of 15 Swordfish. Weather conditions had deteriorated significantly, with gale-force winds, heavy seas, driving rain, and low cloud cover creating dangerous flying conditions. The first sortie of the day nearly ended in disaster due to a communications failure. The aircraft had not been warned that the cruiser Sheffield had been sent forward to shadow Bismarck. Instead, they had been told no other ships were in the vicinity. In poor visibility, the Swordfish crews mistook Sheffield for their target and pressed home their attack. Fortune intervened in the form of a technical malfunction. The torpedoes had been equipped with new magnetic pistol detonators, which proved defective. Some torpedoes exploded on impact with the sea due to faulty magnetic pistols, while Sheffield successfully evaded the remaining torpedoes. No damage was inflicted on the British cruiser, but the incident revealed a critical problem with the torpedo fuses that could have doomed the operation. 5.2 Rearmament and second launch. The Swordfish returned to Ark Royal and were quickly rearmed with torpedoes fitted with reliable contact detonators, older technology known to function properly. The crews faced an even more challenging launch. Conditions had worsened, with Ark Royal's flight deck rising and falling 50 feet, the bows and stern flung from side to side in the angry seas, and driving rain at times blotting out visibility completely. At 19:10 hours, 15 Swordfish took off for their second sortie. The aircraft represented 3 squadrons, 810, 818, and 820 Naval Air Squadrons. Among the pilots was 21-year-old Sub-Lieutenant John "Jock" Moffett, flying Swordfish 5C with his observer Sub-Lieutenant J.D. Dusty Miller and telegraphist Air Gunner Leading Airman A.J. Heyman. 5.3 Approach and Initial Contact. After launch, the Swordfish formation flew through deteriorating conditions toward their target area. At 2000 hours, the aircraft made first contact with Sheffield, which vectored them toward Bismarck. Despite assistance from Sheffield and their ASV-2 radar equipment, the crews initially struggled to locate the German battleship in the murk and gathering darkness. Eventually, the aircraft found their target. Bismarck was sailing under a weather front, a wall of cloud reaching up beyond 10,000 feet and extending down to almost sea level. The Swordfish descended through this cloud barrier like ancient biplanes entering a mythological underworld, emerging into a scene of wind-lashed seas and a massive warship that immediately opened fire with every weapon at its disposal. 5.4 The attack. 15 aircraft against the Dragon. The Swordfish pressed their attack from multiple directions, attempting to overwhelm Bismarck's defenses and increase the probability of hits. The pilots split their approaches between the battleship's port and starboard beams, forcing the German gun crews to divide their fire. Flying at times at 20 feet altitude and just 90 miles per hour, the British torpedo bombers conducted their attack runs through intense anti-aircraft fire. Bismarck's defensive armament was formidable: 105mm secondary guns, 37mm and 20mm anti-aircraft cannon, and even the main 15-inch battery fired at the attacking aircraft, attempting to destroy them with the concussion and water columns from near misses. Sub-Lieutenant Moffett later recalled the experience. "They fired all kinds of things at us. It was like hail coming at you. You wonder how they could miss. Yet miss they largely did, despite the volume and intensity of fire." The combination of the Swordfish's slow speed, extremely low altitude, violent weather conditions, and the fading light created a complex targeting problem that even experienced German gunners could not fully solve. As Moffett positioned his aircraft for the torpedo drop, his observer Miller carefully judged the approach angle and distance, repeatedly telling him, "Not yet, until the optimal release point. Then finally, let her go." The torpedo dropped cleanly from the Swordfish's belly, stabilized in the water, and began its run toward the massive battleship. As Moffett maneuvered his aircraft away from the target through the curtain of anti-aircraft fire, Miller reported, "We've got a runner, Jock." Confirmation that their torpedo was tracking properly toward Bismarck. 5.5 Two torpedoes strike home. 2 torpedoes hit, one on the port quarter and a third on starboard. The first hit struck amidships against Bismarck's armored belt, causing flooding but not critical damage to the heavily protected sections of the ship. However, the second torpedo struck astern, and this hit would prove catastrophic. One torpedo jammed Bismarck's twin rudders, crippling her steering gear and leaving her wallowing out of control in heavy seas. More specifically, the torpedo hit a stern-jammed Bismarck's rudder and steering gear at 12 degrees to port. The technical mechanism of the damage involved both direct impact and structural failure. When the stern was hit by the torpedo, it set up a whiplash effect in the stern structure. Due to heavy armor around the rudder section didn't vibrate like the rest of the stern, causing a partial failure of the stern around the rudder. It was the stern structure collapsing onto the rudder assembly that jammed it in position, not merely the direct torpedo hit itself. 5.6 Immediate effects on Bismarck. The effect on the battleship was immediate and devastating. A German officer aboard Bismarck, Gerhard Junak, later described the moment. "The torpedo hit on the rudder shook the ship so badly that even in my zone of action in the center turbine room, the deck plates were thrown into the air and the hull vibrated violently." Shortly after the impact, Water flooded through the port side gangways into the turbine room, and clouds of gas and smoke filled the compartment until forced ventilation cleared it. The stern compartments began flooding, though damage control parties managed to save the crew stationed in those areas. Bismarck was initially able to steam only in a large circle. The ship's 3 propellers remained functional and could generate considerable power, but without steerage, directional control was impossible. Repair efforts by the crew to free the rudder failed. Multiple solutions were attempted, connecting the manual hand rudder, attempting to cut away the damaged rudder with underwater saws, and even proposals to blow the rudder assembly free with explosives. All proved impossible in the prevailing heavy seas and given the proximity of the propellers to the damaged area. Bismarck attempted to steer by alternating the power of her 3 propeller shafts, a technique that might work in calm conditions but proved inadequate in the Force 8 storm conditions. The wind pressure on the ship's superstructure and hull, combined with the heavy seas, overwhelmed any attempt to maintain course through propeller manipulation alone. The prevailing wind and sea state resulted in the ship being forced to sail northwest, directly toward King George V and Rodney, the 2 British battleships that had been pursuing Bismarck from the west. 6. The remarkable survival of the Swordfish. 6.1 Successful recovery despite damage. Despite the intensity of Bismarck's defensive fire, all 15 Swordfish survived the attack and returned to Ark Royal. This remarkable survival rate demands explanation, as it seems statistically improbable given the volume of anti-aircraft fire directed at the slow-moving biplanes. The weather was still abominable. Many aircraft had been damaged, and 3 crashed on landing, but no one was hurt. The crashes resulted from a combination of battle damage, pilot exhaustion, and the extraordinarily difficult conditions for carrier operations, with the flight deck heaving violently in the storm. 6.2 Factors contributing to survival. Several factors combined to allow the Swordfish to survive their attack run. Low speed and altitude. The Swordfish's approach at 90 miles per hour and altitudes of 20 to 50 feet created significant targeting challenges for German fire control systems calibrated for faster, higher altitude threats. Extreme weather conditions. The violent seas, driving rain, and deteriorating light conditions significantly reduced visibility and complicated range finding. Gun crews had difficulty tracking targets that appeared intermittently through rain squalls and sea spray. Multiple attack vectors. By approaching from different directions simultaneously, the Swordfish forced Bismarck's gun crews to divide their attention and fire, reducing the concentration of defensive fire any individual aircraft faced. Fabric construction. The Swordfish's fabric-covered airframe could absorb considerable shell fragment damage without catastrophic structural failure. Small-caliber shells might pass through the fabric without exploding, whereas metal-skinned aircraft would suffer more severe damage from the same hits. Deck-level attack profile. Flying so low meant the Swordfish approached below the depression limits of many of Bismarck's anti-aircraft guns, which could not achieve the necessary downward angle to engage targets so close to the water surface. 6.3 German gunnery perspective. From the German perspective, the failure to destroy any attacking aircraft despite expending enormous quantities of ammunition represented a frustrating failure of their defensive systems. The anti-aircraft director crews fired everything available, light cannon, machine guns, and even the main battery, without achieving a single confirmed kill against the obsolescent biplanes. This outcome partly reflected the inadequacy of Bismarck's anti-aircraft systems for the specific threat profile presented by low-altitude torpedo bombers in severe weather. The ship's anti-aircraft armament had been designed primarily to engage conventional level bombers and dive bombers attacking from higher altitudes in clearer conditions. 7. The night of 26 to 27 May, Bismarck's agony. 7.1 Destroyer attacks through the night. With Bismarck crippled and unable to maintain course, Captain Philip Vien's 4th Destroyer Flotilla, consisting of HMS Cossack, HMS Maori, HMS HMS Seek, and the Polish destroyer ORP Piron, maintained contact and conducted harassment attacks throughout the night. Between 22:38 and 6:56 hours, the destroyers made 10 approaches and fired 16 torpedoes, but none hit. Bismarck's main and secondary armament remained operational, and the gun crews fought their ship with determination despite the hopelessness of their situation. One of Bismarck's shells sheared off Cossack's antenna, and 3 other shells straddled Zulu, wounding 3 men. The constant harassment served multiple purposes beyond the unlikely possibility of scoring a torpedo hit. The attacks prevented Bismarck's crew from focusing on damage control and rudder repair efforts. The need for continuous vigilance and manning of battle stations exhausted an already fatigued crew. The psychological impact of unceasing attacks through a storm-lashed night deepened the sense of inevitable doom. 7.2 Admiral Luchen's final message. At 23:40 hours on May 26th, Admiral Luchen's delivered to Group West, the German command base, the signal, "Ship unmaneuverable. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer." This transmission confirmed to German Naval Command that Bismarck was doomed and would not reach port. The message's tone reflected the combination of defiant determination and recognition of inevitable fate that characterized the German crew's final hours. The crew of Bismarck understood their situation with clarity. Without steerage, the ship could not escape. British heavy units were converging from multiple directions. By dawn, they would face the combined firepower of battleships whose guns matched or exceeded their own, but without the ability to maneuver to engage effectively or avoid incoming fire. 7.3 Impossible hyper effort. Throughout the night, Bismarck's engineering and damage control parties attempted every conceivable method to restore steering capability. Proposals to force the rudder out from below with explosives were rejected because of the proximity to the propellers. The hand-operated steering mechanism was connected, but the damaged rudder would not respond to manual inputs. The structural damage to the stern prevented access to the rudder compartments for direct mechanical repair. The ship pitched so violently in the strong sea swell that it was impossible to keep a foothold in the turbulent water surging through the companionways. Divers could not work in such conditions, and cutting equipment could not be effectively deployed against the heavy rudder assembly. Some post-war analysts suggested various alternative approaches. Improvised sea anchors, attempting to steer in reverse, or blowing the rudder completely free even at risk to the propellers. However, with 3 propellers capable of driving Bismarck at 28 knots, the crew found no alternative but to head slowly toward the enemy. 8. The Final Battle. May 27, 1941. 8.1 Convergence of British forces. By dawn on May 27th, Admiral Sir John Tovey had successfully positioned HMS King George V and HMS Rodney for the final engagement. The heavy cruisers HMS Norfolk and HMS Dorsetshire completed the cordon around the crippled German battleship. At 8:43 hours, lookouts on King George V spotted Bismarck approximately 25,000 yards distant. Rodney opened fire first at 8:47, followed quickly by King George V. The range rapidly closed as the British battleships approached the nearly stationary target. 8.2 Unical combat. Bismarck was unable to steer due to the torpedo damage to the rudders, and the consequent unpredictable motions made the ship an unstable gun platform and created a difficult gunnery problem. Nevertheless, Bismarck returned fire at 8:50 with her forward guns, and with her second salvo, she straddled Rodney. This represented the closest Bismarck came to scoring a hit on any British warship in the final engagement. The battle rapidly turned into an execution. Without maneuverability, Bismarck could not maintain optimal range or bearing to her opponents. The British battleships systematically worked closer, pouring shell after shell into the German ship. Rodney alone fired 380 16-inch shells, while King George V employed 339 14-inch shells. Over 2,000 additional shells were collectively fired by the British warships. At 9:02 hours, a 16-inch shell from Rodney struck Bismarck's forward fire control position, essentially blinding the ship's gunnery direction. From this point, effective return fire became impossible. Additional hits destroyed turrets, penetrated armor, started massive fires, and inflicted catastrophic casualties among the crew. 8.3 Scuttling and Final Minutes. By 10 o'clock hours, Bismarck had been reduced to a burning hulk. Her main armament was silenced. Fires raged throughout the ship, and she had developed a significant list. Recognizing the ship was doomed, the surviving crew initiated scuttling procedures, opening seacocks and setting demolition charges to ensure the ship would not fall into British hands intact. While the British cruiser Dorsetshire was busy rescuing survivors from the water, Midshipman Joe Brooks jumped over the side to help wounded Germans scramble up his ship's side. One German sailor who had lost both arms was hanging onto a rope with his teeth. Despite Brooks's efforts, he could not be saved. At 10:36 hours on May 27th, 1941, Bismarck capsized a port and sank in approximately 4,800 meters of water, her ensign still flying. Of her crew of over 2,200 men, only 109 survivors were rescued by British warships. An additional 5 sailors were later recovered by German vessels. The death toll exceeded 2,000 men, including Admiral Lütjens and Captain Ernst Lindemann. The immediate rescue effort was cut short when at 11:40 hours, a lookout on Dorsetshire thought he spotted a periscope, and the rescue effort was abandoned while hundreds of Bismarck survivors were still in the water. 9. Analysis: the confluence of chance and necessity. 9.1 The Lucky Torpedo: Probability and Vulnerability. The characterization of the fatal torpedo hit as lucky merits careful examination. From one perspective, the hit represented extraordinary fortune. A single torpedo among dozens launched during multiple attacks struck the one location where Bismarck was genuinely vulnerable, her unarmored stern section housing the rudder mechanisms. Bismarck's armor scheme reflected standard battleship design philosophy of the era. Heavy armor protected magazines, machinery spaces, and other vital areas against enemy gunfire. However, stern sections housing steering gear received significantly less protection, based on the calculation that the probability of a hit in this specific location during surface combat was acceptably low. This design assumption proved fatally flawed when confronted with aerial torpedo attack. The vulnerability was not unique to Bismarck. Most contemporary battleships featured relatively thin armor protection for steering gear compartments. The Japanese battleship Yamato, often considered the most heavily armored warship ever built, similarly featured only 55 millimeters of armor protecting her steering compartments, adequate against shell fragments, but vulnerable to direct torpedo hits. From another perspective, the hit represented not merely chance, but the inevitable outcome of persistent effort. 15 aircraft launched torpedoes at close range against a ship that, despite its armor and armament, presented a substantial target. The probability of scoring hits increased with each attack sortie. British naval aviation had conducted 2 major attacks within 36 hours, launching a total of 24 aircraft carrying torpedoes. That two torpedoes found their mark represents a success rate of approximately 8.3%, low by statistical standards, but sufficient to achieve the mission objective. 9.2 Weather as tactical factor. The severe weather conditions on May 26, 1941 functioned simultaneously as obstacle and enabler for the Swordfish attack. The storm made carrier operations extraordinarily dangerous, complicated navigation, and pushed both aircraft and aircrew to their operational limits. Yet these same conditions degraded Bismarck's defensive effectiveness and provided the attacking aircraft with a measure of concealment. The driving rain and sea spray reduced visibility, complicating target acquisition and tracking for German gun crews. The violent motion of the ship in heavy seas affected both gunnery accuracy and the stability of optical range-finding equipment. The low cloud ceiling and deteriorating light as evening approached created additional challenges for visual target tracking. Conversely, the Swordfish's robust construction and benign handling characteristics made it well suited to operations in marginal weather that would have grounded more modern aircraft types. The slow approach speeds that made the aircraft seem obsolete actually provided enhanced control during low-altitude flight in turbulent conditions. 9.3 Comparison to Prince of Wales damage. An instructive comparison exists between the battle damage sustained by HMS Prince of Wales on May 24th and the torpedo damage to Bismarck on May 26th. Prince of Wales suffered multiple shell hits from Bismarck's 15-inch guns during the Denmark Strait engagement, including penetrations below the waterline that caused flooding. Despite this damage, Prince of Wales retained full maneuverability and could steam at high speed, allowing her to disengage from the action and eventually return to port for repairs. Bismarck, struck by a single torpedo in her stern, immediately lost all directional control and became tactically helpless despite suffering minimal casualties and retaining full propulsive power. This comparison illustrates a fundamental principle. Catastrophic mission kill can result from relatively minor physical damage if that damage affects a critical, non-redundant system. Modern warship design incorporates damage control doctrine, recognizing that steering capability represents such a critical vulnerability, leading to redundant rudder systems and enhanced stern protection in later vessels. 9.4 Strategic implications for naval warfare. The destruction of Bismarck provided multiple strategic lessons that influenced subsequent naval doctrine and ship design. Aircraft carrier primacy. The engagement demonstrated conclusively that aircraft carriers could decisively affect the outcome of naval campaigns, even when operating with obsolescent aircraft. The torpedo hit that crippled Bismarck came from a biplane that first flew in 1934, yet this antiquated weapon system accomplished what conventional surface units alone might not have achieved within the available time frame. Vulnerability of surface units. Even the most heavily armored, powerfully armed battleship could be rendered helpless by damage to unarmored or lightly armored auxiliary systems. This reality accelerated the decline of the battleship as the capital ship of naval forces and the corresponding rise of the aircraft carrier as the dominant platform for naval power projection. Importance of air cover. Bismarck's inability to reach the protective range of Luftwaffe fighter cover proved decisive. Had the battleship been equipped with organic air defense in the form of embarked fighter aircraft, impossible given her design as a gun-armed battleship, or had she reached waters where land-based air cover could be provided, the Swordfish attacks might have been disrupted or prevented entirely. Persistence in maritime patrol and strike operations. The success of the British effort depended fundamentally on maintaining contact with the target through persistent aerial reconnaissance and being prepared to launch attacks under marginal weather conditions. The Catalina sighting and the willingness to launch the Swordfish in storm conditions proved essential to mission success. Aftermath and historical significance. 10.1 Impact on German naval strategy. The loss of Bismarck profoundly affected German naval strategy for the remainder of the war. The Kriegsmarine never again attempted a major surface sortie by capital ships into the Atlantic. The remaining German battleship, Tirpitz, Bismarck's sister ship, spent most of her operational life in Norwegian fjords, where her mere presence as a fleet in being tied down substantial British naval resources, but where she never engaged in major surface combat. The destruction of Bismarck validated the British decision to pursue the ship relentlessly despite the risks and resource commitments involved. Had Bismarck reached Brest safely after destroying Hood, the psychological and strategic implications would have been profound. German surface raiders would have posed a persistent, credible threat to Atlantic convoys, potentially requiring diversion of British naval resources from other theaters, including the Mediterranean. 10.2 Recognition and Commemoration. The aircrew who participated in the decisive attack received appropriate recognition for their achievement. Sub-Lieutenant Moffett and the other Swordfish crews were decorated for their actions, though the specific identity of which torpedo struck the fatal blow remained uncertain, as multiple aircraft claimed hits and the chaos of combat made definitive attribution impossible. In later years, Moffett became the public face of the attack, giving numerous interviews and writing about his experiences. He consistently emphasized the collective nature of the achievement and the courage of all aircrew involved. When asked in old age about being the man who crippled Bismarck, he characteristically deflected attention to his colleagues. "I was just part of the team." The full crew of Bismarck is remembered with complex emotions. Recognition of the courage of sailors fighting a hopeless battle, tempered by acknowledgement of the regime they served. The loss of over 2,000 young men, many conscripts with no particular loyalty to Nazi ideology, represents one of the war's many tragedies. 10.3 Archaeological Evidence from the Wreck. The wreck of Bismarck was discovered in 1989 by Dr. Robert Ballard at a depth of approximately 4,800 meters in the Atlantic Ocean southwest of Brest. Subsequent expeditions have examined the wreck site extensively, providing physical evidence that helps resolve historical controversies about the ship's final moments. The wreck shows extensive battle damage consistent with the prolonged bombardment by British battleships. However, examination of the hull structure also reveals evidence supporting the scuttling claims by German survivors. Holes consistent with demolition charges and open seacocks that would have accelerated the ship's sinking. Critically for the present study, examination of the stern section confirmed the catastrophic nature of the steering gear damage. The rudder assembly remains jammed at approximately 12 degrees to port, exactly as reported by German survivors. The structural damage to the stern section visible on the wreck validates accounts of the whiplash effect and structural failure that jammed the rudder mechanism beyond any possibility of repair. 10 point for the Swordfish's continued service. Despite, or perhaps because of its role in crippling Bismarck, the Swordfish remained in frontline service throughout World War II, outlasting multiple aircraft types designed to replace it. This string bag ultimately served with distinction in anti-submarine warfare, mine-laying, and continued torpedo attacks until 1945. The final operational Swordfish mission was flown in June 1945, making the type one of the few biplanes to serve throughout the entire war. Production continued until August 1944, with 2,391 aircraft manufactured. This longevity reflected both the aircraft's reliability and versatility, and the Royal Navy's pragmatic recognition that newer aircraft types did not necessarily perform better in all operational circumstances. The Swordfish that attacked Bismarck on May 26, 1941, embodied a paradox central to military history. Obsolescence in one dimension can coexist with decisive effectiveness in specific circumstances. The slow, fabric-covered biplane proved capable of achievements beyond the reach of more advanced weapon systems when employed with courage, skill, and persistence. 11. Conclusion. Fortune, skill, and historical contingency. The crippling of Bismarck by a single Swordfish torpedo on May 26, 1941 represents a convergence of multiple factors: technological vulnerability, environmental conditions, tactical persistence, human courage, and the irreducible element of chance that pervades military operations. The torpedo hit was lucky insofar as it struck a critical, lightly protected location and inflicted damage that happened to be irreparable under the prevailing conditions. Yet luck alone provides an insufficient explanation. The hit resulted from a coordinated attack by 15 aircraft flown by highly trained crews, launched despite severe weather conditions, and pressed home with determination against intense defensive fire. The lucky hit came at the culmination of a sophisticated intelligence and operational campaign involving reconnaissance aircraft, surface forces, and carrier-based aviation working in coordination across hundreds of miles of ocean. The destruction of Bismarck validated the emerging primacy of naval aviation and exposed the vulnerability of even the most powerful surface combatants to aerial attack. The engagement demonstrated that determination and persistence could overcome apparent technological obsolescence, and that single-point failures in complex weapon systems could have catastrophic consequences regardless of the overall robustness of the platform. For the aircrew of the Swordfish, the attack represented the culmination of training, courage, and skill applied under the most demanding operational conditions. For Bismarck's crew, the damage inflicted by that single torpedo transformed a tactical withdrawal into a death trap, demonstrating how rapidly fortunes can reverse in naval warfare. The Battle of the Atlantic would continue for 4 more years, with hundreds of convoys running the gauntlet of U-boats and aircraft. But after May 27, 1941, no German capital ship ever again sortied into those contested waters with the intention of directly attacking Allied merchant shipping. In this sense, the crippling of Bismarck by obsolescent biplanes flying through a storm represented not merely a tactical victory, but a strategic turning point, helping ensure that Britain would survive and eventually prevail in the longest continuous military campaign of World War II. The story of the Swordfish attack on Bismarck endures not because it represents the inevitable triumph of advanced technology over outdated systems, but precisely because it demonstrates the opposite, that courage, skill, and determination can overcome technological disadvantage, that operational persistence matters, that weather and environmental conditions can equalize disparities in capability, and that in warfare, the outcome often hinges on which torpedo strikes which section of which ship, in which particular sea state, on which particular evening. Sub-Lieutenant John Moffett, reflecting in his later years on that twilight attack, through storm and fire against the most powerful battleship afloat, perhaps expressed the essential truth most simply. We were just doing our job. We didn't think about being heroes. We thought about getting the torpedo in the water and getting home. That they accomplished both, and in doing so changed the course of the naval war, stands as testament to the extraordinary achievements possible when training, courage, and determination meet opportunity. Even when flying an obsolete biplane through a North Atlantic storm toward a ship whose broadside could shatter mountains. Bibliography and references. This historical analysis draws upon the following categories of sources. Primary sources: action reports from HMS Ark Royal, HMS Victorious, and participating squadrons, German naval records and survivor testimonies, radio intercepts and signals intelligence, logbooks and operational records from Force H and Home Fleet units. Survivor testimonies. Interviews with Swordfish aircrew including Sub-Lieutenant John Moffett, Lieutenant Commander Eugene S. Mond, and Telegraphist Air Gunner Lesseyer. Account from German survivors, including engineering officer Gerhard Junak. British destroyer personnel accounts. Technical documentation. Bismarck construction specifications and damage control reports. Ferry Swordfish operational manuals and performance specifications. Torpedo technology specifications. Battleship armor scheme documentation. Archaeological evidence. Robert Ballard expedition reports on Bismarck wreck site discovery and examination. Subsequent deep-sea exploration documentation of wreck condition and damage patterns. Secondary historical analysis. British official naval history. German naval histories. Tactical analyses by naval historians. Biographical works on participants. Strategic assessments of Atlantic campaign. Weather and environmental data. Meteorological records for North Atlantic, May 1941. Sea state analyses. Visibility and operational condition assessments. The convergence of these sources enables a comprehensive understanding of the events of May 26, 1941, and their significance within the broader context of naval warfare evolution during World War II.